Tonight I want to take us back to a different era. An era when Hollywood sided with the Palestinians, but in those days, the Jews were the Palestinians. So it was a very different time when Hollywood actually sided with the Jewish cause. It was an unusual era. I want to talk a little bit about the history and the circumstances, why America's cultural elite responded the way they did. And I'm very pleased and honored that we have with us tonight someone who is an actual eyewitness to those events. And so as we're talking about, as I'm speaking from the historian's perspective about the diplomatic and political context of those events, I'm also going to be pausing to ask Ellen Adler about her eyewitness accounts of some of the things that we're going to be talking about. So you'll hear firsthand about legendary figures like Marlon Brando. I mean, I can talk about, what I've read about Marlon Brando, but Ellen can tell you about dating Marlon Brando, which is clearly a lot more interesting. I can already tell by your response. Much more interesting. You get the boring historian out of the way. Let's talk about some Hollywood stuff. Well, we'll get to it. We'll get to it, and soon, I promise. This is the playbill from a remarkable play that opened on Broadway in the autumn of 1946. A Flag is Born. And the flag that they're referring to was the Jewish or the Zionist flag. Because this was a play which was intimately connected to the entire struggle, both in America and in British Mandatory Palestine, the struggle to bring about the creation, I should say the recreation, the rebirth of a sovereign Jewish state after 2,000 years. It didn't just spring out of nowhere, of course. To some extent, what one might say is it sprang from the ashes of Auschwitz. And in Marlon Brando's memoirs, he talks about that. And let me just reflect for a moment on where Brando fits into all of this. Today, we talk a lot about how American Jews responded to the Holocaust. It's a frequent topic of conversation in the Jewish community. And it has been for a number of years. It wasn't always. But if you ask me as a historian, who was the first public figure in America to start raising this question? How did American Jews respond to news of the Holocaust? Did they speak out or were they silent? Did they look away or did they protest? If you ask me who was the first well-known American personality to raise this issue, you know what I would tell you? Marlon Brando. And here's how. The play, Flag is Born, was the brainchild, as you see in the playbill, of Ben Hecht. Ben Hecht, who we see here on the closest to me. Ben Hecht in the 1930s was the most popular and successful screenwriter in Hollywood. And today, many of the movies he wrote are, of course, still the stuff of legend. He was one of the biggest names in Hollywood. Hecht did not grow up with a strong sense of Jewish identity. But as happened to many people in those days, the rise of Hitler, the reports about the persecution of Jews in Germany and then the rest of Europe brought Ben Hecht back to his Jewish identity and back to the Jewish people. And he came back with a roar. Hecht became involved with a group of dissident Jewish activists. So this Committee for a Free Palestine, which was more commonly known as the Bergson Group, was an activist group in an era when Jewish activism, as we know it, was not the most common phenomenon. They were in Washington lobbying congressmen about rescuing Jews, about creating a Jewish state, lobbying them at a time when there was no Jewish lobby. Some might say the Bergson Group was the first Jewish lobby. There was no AIPAC in those days. Today you have probably 8 or 10 different Jewish lobby groups, but in those days, this was a radical thing for Jewish activists to be pleading for a Jewish cause in the halls of the United States Congress. They organized a march by 400 rabbis to the White House just before Yom Kippur in 1943, at a time when Jews did not march to the White House. In fact, that march was the only public protest in Washington about the persecution of the Jews during the entire Holocaust period. just that one. So the Bergson group were activists who thought out of the box. They looked for unusual ways to promote the cause of the Jews, to bring to the attention of the public the mass murder of the Jews, and then after the war, to try to rally American public support for the idea of creating a Jewish state. And so Hecht came up with the idea to write a play, to bring the cause to the stage, not just the usual Jewish approach of press releases and private meetings, but to thrust the cause of Jewish statehood right out into the spotlight and to try to reach as many people as possible through ways that you normally do reach people. Film, theater. This is Hecht showing a copy of the script to Senator Guy Gillette of Iowa. Senator Gillette, by the way, just to mention, Senator Gillette is an interesting example of a member of Congress who ordinarily might not be expected to have any interest in Jewish causes. I said he was from Iowa. How many Jewish votes do you think Senator Gillette thought he would get in Iowa? Moreover, Gillette was a Democrat. He was a Democrat, so it took political courage for someone like Gillette to, for example, speak out and challenge the Roosevelt administration for not taking action to rescue the Jews. And then after the war, to challenge President Truman to support the Jewish cause. And so this was a publicity shot of Hecht showing the script to Gillette. I want you to notice something interesting. The poster on the back behind them. You can only see the top. Look at the headline. It is 1776 in Palestine. So the Bergson group was very savvy about using arguments that would appeal to the American public. Very frequently in their literature, in their newspaper ads, in their pamphlets, and in A Flag is Born, as we will see, they appeal to these American themes. They compare the Jewish revolt against the British to the American Revolution against the British. And it was an effective argument. It was a good way to help people who didn't know a lot about the issue to kind of understand the basics. Yes, our struggle is like America's struggle. Look at the imagery in this poster for A Flag is Born. See the three patriots of the American Revolution. Same kind of thing. The shovels and down here, and the intermingling here of like the Zionist pioneers, the American pioneers and revolutionaries. To create a Broadway play, you need a lot of ingredients. And so Hecht turned to his close friends and colleagues in Hollywood and asked them to volunteer, and they did. They volunteered to create this extraordinary theater production. Luther Adler agreed to direct. Luther Adler from the famous Adler acting family, which we're going to hear a lot about momentarily.
My uncle.
For people like Hecht and for like Ellen's uncle Luther Adler, the prevalence of anti-Semitism in America, and then the horrors, of course, of seeing what anti-Semitism had wrought in Europe, was something that kind of drove them back into an affirmation of the Jewish cause and of their Jewish identity. And so here they were willing to work they were volunteering, working for free on a play like this, or in the case of the actors, like Marlon Brando, working for Actors Guild minimum wage. But the point is that the cause meant something to them. When the Holocaust ended, hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors remained in Europe in displaced persons camps. They were known as DPs. And these were people who wanted to go to Palestine, to the land of Israel, but the British had shut the gates of Palestine back in 1939 because of Arab opposition to Jewish immigration. So Palestine, the Jews of Palestine wanted to welcome their brethren from Europe, but the British had shut the gates. Hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors languishing in these DP camps where conditions, in some cases, were awful. In fact, the conditions are as bad as they were, almost as bad as they were under the Nazis, but it's horrid conditions, squalid, disease. Jewish prisoners and former Nazi guards living, forced to live almost side by side. It was really an appalling situation. And it increased the sense in the American Jewish community, something has to be done. The British are going to have to open the doors. A Jewish state has to arise. The United States must support this just cause. But it didn't support it right away. President Truman, when he came into office, did not have an established set of firm beliefs about what would happen, about what the future of Palestine should be, whether there should be a Jewish state or not. And in this period, 1945, 1946, 1947, kind of was going back and forth. The State Department was vehemently opposed to Zionism. They did not want a Jewish state to arise because they thought it would ruin America's relations with the Arab world. Truman was uncertain, and it was to the White House that a lot of the pressure from something like this play was directed. The play was, in the first instance, of course, aimed at people who would attend the performances, and then after that, people who would read about the performances in the press. But beyond that, by bringing in America's cultural elite to a certain extent, by making it a public issue that was embraced by prominent Americans, including those of stage and screen, was an attempt by the Berkson Group and Ben Hecht to increase the pressure on the White House, on the Truman administration, to support creating a Jewish state. So, Luther Adler directed. Stella Adler, Ellen's mother, a statuesque actress and later famous as an acting coach, and today there are still very important Stella Adler studios for acting, both here in Manhattan and in Los Angeles. Stella Adler had been active in the Berkson Group for years. She had been active during the Holocaust period, and she continued to be active with them in this post-Holocaust period that we're talking about now. It was Stella who suggested her most prominent young protege to take the leading role in A Flag is Born, and that was 22-year-old Marlon Brando. Now, Ellen was at some of the rehearsals for the play, and she knew Brando quite well, and I think she can shed a little light on what he was like, what brought him to the Jewish cause, and tell us a little bit, please.
Well, he came from Omaha, Nebraska, and I don't think he'd ever met Jewish people. And then he studied acting at the New School with my mother, and he came to the house all the time. We saw each other a lot. And he made my Uncle Luther live right across the street, and he got to know this family of Jewish theater people. And he said, the laughter was such, it was like watching ping pong balls fly around in the air, because it was all actors and all fun and everything. So Luther said, do you think that this young actor can take this on? And my mother said, he's a genius, he can do anything.
There are three main characters in the play. There's an elderly couple, Tevye and Zelda. Zelda was played by Celia Adler. So Celia Adler was Stella's sister and Luther's half-sister. Yeah. They had all been, as Ellen alluded, they had all been major figures in the Yiddish theater. Stella, your grandfather, Jacob Adler, was really the father of the turn-of-the-century Yiddish theater in New York. So this was an acting family. So, and here you had a good chunk of the family right here in this one play. So Celia Adler played Zelda. Tevye was played by Paul Muni.
Muni was a very big movie star. He had played Louis Pasteur, and he was a big movie star at that time, Paul Muni. He was, the others were people who were unemployed, but Muni was a very big star.
Muni also had come out of the Yiddish theater. That's where his roots were. But he had, as Ellen says, he had made it big in the broader world of film. Yeah. And then you had Marlon Brando playing this young man named David. Most of the play takes place in a cemetery. Tevye and Zelda are wandering across Europe in the aftermath of the Holocaust, like in the ashes, really, of the Holocaust, trying to make their way to Palestine, and they stop to rest in a cemetery, in a Jewish cemetery, and that's where most of the play takes place. And in that cemetery, who do they encounter but this young man, David, played by Marlon Brando. So there's a scene in the play where Brando gives a fiery speech where he's facing the audience and he kind of is challenging the world. How could you dare to abandon the Jews? Why were you silent when the Germans were throwing us into the ovens? And it's a long speech, and his voice is gradually rising, becoming more emotional and more powerful. And at a certain point, he's not just challenging the Allies, but he turns to American Jewry. And he says, American Jews, where were you when millions of our brethren were being slaughtered by the Germans? Where were you when they were turning us into garbage, because it calls them the garbage heap of history? Where were you? And he's saying it louder and louder. And Brando in his memoirs talks about how the audiences were got very emotionally caught up in the play. And this is Brando writes this. He says, in those days, a lot of American Jews were feeling rather guilty about the fact that they had not responded vigorously enough to news of the Holocaust. And they got very worked up, particularly at this point in the play. And he says at the first or second performance, when he started yelling, his voice is rising almost to a yell. Where were you, Jews? Where were you? He said a young woman in the front row jumped up and yelled, where were you?
That's right. He was 19, Brando, and he was in black, just in black all the way down. But he was a 19-year-old baby, really.
So that was the team which put together the play that we're describing. Here's a shot of the marquee. It opened at the Alvin, which is today called the Neil Simon. It's the Neil Simon Theater, and it ran at the Alvin it was originally scheduled for a relatively short run, I think 8 weeks, but they ended up extending it for many more because every night it was packed. Ellen's mother, Stella Adler, was in some of the performances because there was a narrator who was needed, and so she alternated with a very prominent journalist of that day, Quentin Reynolds. But there's a shot of Stella at one of the shows. The play reaches its climax with Tevye dying. Tevye passes away. Brando dramatically takes his tallis, fashions it into this kind of makeshift Zionist flag, raises it high, and here's that scene, and kind of marches off into the sunset, almost literally, symbolizing the Jewish determination to build a new state to build up from the horrors of the Holocaust that the Jews had just experienced. The play, so after its extended run on Broadway, they took Flag is Born to a number of other cities. Brando, unfortunately, had a contractual obligation on the waterfront. He couldn't do the out-of-town performances. Brando sent Ben Hecht a telegram saying he's got this contractual obligation for a film that's going to make it impossible for him to travel, but maybe he should cancel it. And didn't Hecht send back some kind of like a wise guy answer like, the Jews have been suffering for thousands of years. Don't worry, a couple more weeks. Go ahead, we'll manage without you. Something like that. So, right? So Brando went off to do, I think it was on the waterfront. And in each city that it appeared, there was a different prominent actor took the role of David. So for example, in Boston, I think it was Jacob Ben-Ami. But in Baltimore, things got very interesting in Baltimore. Before they scheduled the performance for Baltimore, they were planning to go to Washington, D.C. And they had booked an engagement at the National Theater in Washington, D.C. Right about that time, a group of playwrights, including Ben Hecht, had just signed an open letter. I think there were 33 of them. The top names, Tennessee Williams, the big names in the playwriting world, including Hecht, had just signed an open letter saying they would not allow any of their plays to be performed at racially segregated theaters. The National was segregated. Hecht realized this only at the last minute. And so, just a week or so before the performance, they moved it to Baltimore. And so they booked the Maryland Theater, major theater in Baltimore, and they arranged for a special train to go from Washington to Baltimore to bring 18 members of Congress who had already said they had been planning to attend the performance. So they brought them up to Baltimore. So they're getting ready to do the show in Baltimore, where the role of David was played by one of Brando's understudies, a young, up-and-coming actor by the name of Sidney Lumet. Lumet, of course, would later go on to become a very famous director.
Sidney Lumet was a star in the Yiddish theater first.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, his
So
father.
they all kind of had the same roots here.
Yeah, he was a star, a little boy, and he was in the Yiddish theater.
Today we remember Lumet more as a director for 12 Angry Men, Dog Day Afternoon, and so on and so forth. But in those days, he was a young actor, just kind of feeling his oats. And he had been one of Brando's understudies, so they brought him down to Baltimore to play the role of David. Now here's where things got sticky. I've already told you, they already had to shift from one city to the next because of the problem of segregation. Well, a couple of days before the performance, somebody noticed and pointed out that the Maryland Theater, although they did admit African Americans, they made them sit in the balcony. So this posed a fresh problem for Ben Hecht and for the Berkson Group. They did not want, they wanted the show to go on, but not under such conditions. It wasn't the same as excluding blacks completely, but still, they were clearly being relegated to inferior seats because of their race. So the Berkson Group teamed up with the local chapter of the NAACP. And they confronted the theater management with kind of a good cop, bad cop strategy. The Berkson Group pleaded on the merits of the cause, as I said earlier, pleaded on the merits of the cause. Everyone should be allowed to sit freely. And the NAACP played the bad cop. They said, we're going to picket that theater. So so even though we support the Zionist cause and a flag is born, if you're going to if it's shown, we're going to be out there with pickets, and people are going to have to cross picket line to see it. So at the last minute, the theater management, or I don't know who came up with this idea, but they all agreed on a kind of an ingenious solution, which was to rent the theater out to the Berkson Group for the evening, so that the Berkson Group, as the management, could then have whatever seating policy they wanted. And so the showing of A Flag is Born, by the way, on Lincoln's birthday in Baltimore, was the first time that African Americans were allowed to sit freely in a major theater in the city of Baltimore. The NAACP called it a tradition-shattering victory. And about 15 African Americans, including several staff members of the Berkson Group, attended that performance. It was remarked upon in the press. And the NAACP, and I know this because I went through their papers, the records of the NAACP are at the Library of Congress, and I've looked at them, so I saw how this story unfolded, and they used the precedent of desegregating for that one night with A Flag is Born. They used that to force the other theaters in Baltimore to all desegregate in the next 5 years. So it turned out to be an extraordinary accomplishment. And Ben Hecht, upon hearing how this was resolved, was of course delighted, and he sent a congratulatory telegram to the NAACP saying that the cause of justice in the Middle East and the cause of justice here in Baltimore are equally close to our hearts. And he said how he was deeply proud that it was his play which was used to smash the racial segregation barriers in Baltimore. But ticket sales with performances around the country ended up reaping a pretty sizable amount. And what did they do with the money? They took the money and they bought a ship. And they renamed the ship, when I say they, I mean the Berkson Group. They renamed the ship the SS Ben Hecht. And they sent it to Europe, where it picked up 800 Holocaust survivors, DPs, on the French coast, and made a beeline for the coast of Palestine. So this was a period when there were a number of attempts to bring shiploads of survivors to the Holy Land. Most of the ships were intercepted, as of course the Exodus was. The Ben Hecht was also intercepted, and its passengers were sent to a detention camp in Cyprus. But the controversy over the voyage of the Ben Hecht, like the controversy over the Exodus, accomplished something very important. It brought the plight of the Jews to the attention of the international community, to the American public, to the White House, which could not ignore the pressure of public opinion. It put pressure on the British, of course, because it was a black eye in terms of public relations. What a black eye it was to have a ship like the Exodus, to have these poor people forced to go back, and in your case with hoses and rubber truncheons and Holocaust survivors beaten by British police and forced, in the case of the Exodus, forced to return to Germany or to France, but forced to return back to that graveyard that Europe had become for the Jewish people. So you had, during this period, an extraordinary intersection of forces and factors in public life. You had the plight, you had the real, everyday plight of the survivors. You had Jews in Palestine fighting the British, trying to bring about creation of an independent state. You had an American public increasingly sympathetic and alarmed about what was happening to the Jews in Palestine. You had an American Jewish community aroused, in part, by the efforts such as A Flag is Born, aroused about this cause, and mobilized into a serious political force. And you had Hollywood. And you had prominent figures in Hollywood, not just the ones who we've talked about here in A Flag is Born, but others whose names appear on some of those newspaper ads I mentioned, or who held fundraising parties. People like Groucho Marx was part of this effort. Frank Sinatra. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis did benefit performances at the Copacabana to raise money for this cause. You had an array of stars of theater, of film, of music. In many cases, Hollywood's most famous, most beloved stars rallying to this cause. And you know how it works in this world. Even though a prominent actor doesn't necessarily know anything more about the Middle East than anybody else, still, when a beloved actor, beloved cultural celebrity comments on an issue in the news, people pay attention. People pay attention to Hollywood. And the Berkson Group, Ben Hecht, Stella Adler, Marlon Brando, they were onto something when they realized the tremendous potential for mobilizing support and sympathy for the Jewish cause. There was a whole untapped world out there who could really make a difference in the process of bringing about the pressure that would help pave the way for the creation of the State of Israel.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.